it's really a very different audience than I've ever addressed in this job. And I was thinking about it a lot when I started to think about my remarks tonight. And for me, after 18 months in this job, I really feel strongly that this issue, put aside the summer in Gaza, just pretend it didn't happen. Even if it didn't happen, what's happening on anti-Semitism deserves a bigger piece of the Jewish communal pie. Because frankly, for our office, the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, our largest stakeholder is the American Jewish community, no question. But it's really not for us to decide what you all have to say is the biggest piece of the Jewish communal pie. There is so many issues I know that you face. I'm going to give you what I think I've seen over the last 18 months. I'm going to give you, I think, what largely is not my ideas, but what I've heard from people in Jewish communities and governments, primarily in Europe, a bit in Israel, over the last 18 months. And ultimately, you have to decide, but I think the stakes are pretty high. And so what tonight I want to talk about are what are those stakes realistically, what we see, the state of anti-Semitism around the world, what we're doing about it, and what our allies may be doing and what we should be doing. So what's at stake? First is, I think it's really important in this job that we don't oversell and we don't undersell. Either one would be a tragedy. And I think for what it's worth, I think over a number of years we've undersold. But I think it's also really, really important not to say this is not 1939. There are parallels. And God knows what can happen in 10 years. We can't see around 10-year horizons. But in the shorter horizons, the next 5 years, I think that's really important to say. But I also think it's really important to say is what we do face is the viability, the continued viability of Jewish diaspora communities around the world, primarily in Europe. Can they survive? And which ones can survive and under what circumstances? And I think that's big enough of a stake that we should be really concerned. So why does it matter to us? Well, the obvious thing, the human rights agenda is a big piece of the U.S. foreign policy. I see that tension between human rights and kind of bilateral interests almost every day in my job. But I think everybody in the State Department on kind of both sides of those different bureaus, types of bureaus, would tell you almost every day it's appropriate that there's that tension. And then, of course, there's a responsibility worldwide to a Jewish community that experienced the Shoah last century. But I think there's more for the United States at stake. First off, the demographics drive us to look at Europe. Of course, 85% of world Jewry is either in North America or Israel, but the 15% that left, 2/3 are in Europe. Of course, the rest are somewhat in Latin America, Australia, South Africa, a few other places. But one of the things you look at immediately, these are democracies. And I once had someone in a regional bureau say to me, "Why are you always talking about countries in our bureau? We're all democracies." And I said, well, that's the point. Jews have left most of the authoritarian countries of the world, and the problem is in democracies. And why is that a big deal for the United States? Well, because we are going to depend in the 21st century on a whole range of issues and values we hold dear on our fellow democracies around the world. And if these democracies cannot protect pluralistic societies, they can't protect their minority Jewish communities, that says a whole lot about the viability of democracy, and it says it's a very bad news story for the United States. So that is in our basic, fundamental, realistic interests, is to have healthy democracies. And I would say, I've heard people in our department say, we also believe in multicultural societies, that they're stronger, more resilient. And when societies lose that element, and I think all you have to do is go to Poland today, go to the Polish Jewish Museum, and talk to Catholic Poles all the time, who will tell you what we lost 70 years ago was a great tragedy, and we're trying to hold on to a little bit, a piece of it. we're not as strong as we could be if we had that element, the Jewish community together today. So it sounds a little trite, but I think it's really true. Jews are the canaries in the coal mine. And in September, when I was in France and talking to kind of the Jewish community leadership at our Chargé's new home, new residence, one of the things we went through about 45 minutes at lunch, and they're describing what the state of French Jewry was and what the threats are, what's going to happen. And finally, at the end, someone said, but you know, this is ultimately not about us. This is about the fundamental viability and values of the Republic. And if the Republic fails this test, it's not just us. Because when we're gone, there'll be others. It's about what the Republic's all about what democracy is all about. So let's talk a little bit about the state of anti-Semitism as I see it. And again, I am just really going to tell you what I'm seeing and be there, voices of these communities that I've visited. Been to 17 different countries in 18 months. Many of them I've been 2 or 3 times, places like France and Belgium and Netherlands, Ukraine, Poland. And the thing that hits me overwhelmingly is the complexity of anti-Semitism today. So the historical model has got to be Soviet Jewry. If you want a success story, what do you look for? Soviet Jewry. And as difficult as that was, if people looking back in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s and what happened, it's almost a miracle. As difficult as that was, it was easy. There was one address we had to go to. That address was the Kremlin. Today, there's not one country that we just have to go to. There's literally dozens. And in any given country, there's no one address. And between countries, there's dramatic differences. My best illustration of that is some of the results from the FRA survey, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU. And the FRA survey that came out a year ago actually was taken about 2 years, but it took them a year to compile. Looked at 8, I'm sure many of you have seen it. Actually, raise your hand. How many have actually seen the FRA survey or wear it? Oh my God. Always you. Always you. It was a survey of 8 Jewish communities in the EU, representing about 90–95% of EU Jewry. And it was basically looked at the state and particularly anti-Semitism and how people are experiencing it. And my, I wouldn't say favorite, but I think the most important number for me was the question about how have you thought about leaving your home country in the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's essentially that. And the number was, people thinking who have thought about leaving, was 48% in Hungary, 46% in France, and 40% in Belgium. And EU-wide, it was 29%. Now, that's 2 years ago. You can imagine what it is today. But if you came down from Mars and looked at those numbers, you had to say, oh, anti-Semitism in France and Hungary, it's almost exactly the same. And nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing at all. In Western Europe, a place like France, what type of anti-Semitism there? Well, take your pick. Now, the most immediate threat is from French citizens who either emigrated or their parents or their grandparents immigrated from North Africa primarily, but also sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the Middle East, Muslim citizens who are perpetrating violence against Jews. And the survey will tell you, for Jews of France are scared of violence. In Hungary, there's not scared of violence. Now, in Hungary, we have Jobbik, a essentially true fascist party with a Nazi ideology, significant parliamentary representation, and street militia, unofficial street militia. We haven't seen that phenomena, although now we see it both in Hungary and in Greece with Golden Dawn. We haven't seen that phenomena since 1933. So there is one parallel. But Jobbik doesn't attack Jews. It attacks, today at least, largely Roma. And Jews have all kinds of problems in Hungary, and we can talk about it, but they're not getting beaten up or their property by and large vandalized, etc. But in France, besides that, you have right-wing, classic right-wing, closer to Jobbik, people associated with National Front and to the right. You have classical left-wing anti-Semitism, anti-colonialism, anarchism. You have what I would say would be populist in the soccer hooliganism, not so much in France as in other places, but the comedian Dieudonné, who technically came from the left and now is on the right. But really, his people, if you look at kind of his following, it looks to be a cross-section of France, or at least of populist France. And they all sometimes work together. You don't have to look at what happened this summer. Just look at what was called the Anti-Establishment March in downtown Paris in the spring. It was held against Hollande, and there were 17,000 people marching in downtown Paris, and some of them, I don't know if all of them, were yelling, "Jews, Jews, France doesn't belong to you." So this was the part of the society, and by the way, this summer, Hollande and Valls, the Prime Minister and the Interior Minister and Foreign Minister, were tremendous in speaking out against the violence against these Jewish communities. But in the same token, you can't win, because then populist France, or anti-establishment France, and it's not the center-right opposition, because they are largely discredited as well, but people who think that politics is totally not working, both sides are corrupt, they say, yeah, and look, of course they support them. The Jews are part of the establishment. They're running everything. So you want the government to be helpful and supportive, but even when it is, in a situation like France, it's difficult. And the stories are different in every country, as I said, but in Belgium, it's not terribly different. Jews in France tell me they've taken their kids out of public schools. It used to be most Jewish kids in France go to public schools. Today, last year they said a third, and a third. Third public, third Jewish, third Catholic. People were telling me this summer, we're taking them out of Jewish schools sometimes because they're less threatened in a Catholic school. The school's not going to get bombed, or kids are not going to get shot in a Catholic school. So, and that's kind of people in the establishment, people who are well off, etc., and living in Paris downtown. I spent a day in Sarcelles and speaking with a rabbi. Sarcelles, for those of you who don't know it, is about a square kilometer in which about 15,000 Jews and some Christian Chaldeans lived. And they're surrounded by other poor, lower middle class, often immigrants. And where you heard about the bombings of Jewish stores, fire bombings, etc., that's with Sarcelles. 4 stores were firebombed, one owned by Chaldean and the other 3 by Jews. If not for the security police, but also the French Jewish Security Volunteer Organization, SPCJ, they would have torched the kind of community center, which has about, I think it's like 12 synagogues as well as other types of facilities. And I was telling the AJC representative in Paris recently about my trip to Sarcelles and the kind of like heart-rendering stuff that I was hearing from the rabbi. He basically said, in 10 years we'll be gone if this continues. We can't ride on public transportation. I said, well, if you don't wear a kippah, because most of the community is secular, and they don't wear kippahs or Magen David. They said, it doesn't matter, they can tell who we are. So it's a crapshoot every time you get on public transportation. My heart was breaking. I was telling the AJC representative, Simon, about this, and I was kind of proud of myself. Look, I went to the suburbs, not just nice part of France. I was really getting my fingers dirty. She said, you think that's bad? Go to some of the suburbs where there's not a concentration of Jews. Their synagogues are in basements because they're frightened, terrified of being seen worshiping. And those people are leaving much faster. They have money to Paris, maybe Aliyah, but they're coming to Sarcelles. While Sarcelles Jews are leaving, if they have the money, they're going to downtown Paris, or they're making Aliyah. A lot of these people, 50 years ago, remember that they fled from North Africa, and now they're fleeing again. As I said, Hungary is a very different situation. We have Jobbik, but we also have nationalist elements, some that represent the government, who are determined to build some kind of new narrative about Hungarian nationalism, which means you have to reach back to the interwar period or the war period. And that means the type of things, when you think about the Holocaust, you have to say or these folks feel they have to say is, yes, there were a few collaborators, but basically this was all about the Germans. And there were a lot of good stories of Hungarians rescuing Jews. All that's true. But of course, and the Germans did take over Hungary. Hungary had been a German ally until March of '44. And most of the Jews, though not all, there were massacres, etc. Most of the Jews were not touched up through March of '44. And between 2 months, between May and June, and July, 3 months really, almost 500,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Very few came back. Now, there were no German troops to speak of in Hungary. They were all Hungarian gendarmes. Hungarians had done the census to know where Jews were outside of Budapest. They knew how to collect them. It was the gendarmes who put them on the trains, the gendarmes who transport them to the Polish border. But we don't want to talk about that. And one of the things I see in Eastern Europe, though the problems are very different, is an inability sometimes to really confront history. If you don't confront history, I am convinced you don't really start confronting anti-Semitism today. And then there's Turkey. 17,000 Jews. There used to be 140,000. Many of them, I was surprised. They weren't all saying we want to leave. They enjoy Turkish culture. But the types of pressure they are under is unbearable. During this summer, there were many voices that said, basically either the chief rabbi or the community leadership, you must denounce Israel. The head of the nonprofit that took the flotilla into Israeli waters said, the Jews of France will pay the price for what Israel's doing today. The Jews of Turkey will pay the price for what Israel's doing today. And there was just an incident in the last few days that I heard about that we were asked to at least make some calls, see what we could do. When I think of all these things, I think of one story, which is about Jewish press, and I think that it's very illustrative to me. I went to Greece in the spring. There was a 70th commemoration in a town called Yanina, beautiful northwest Greece, surrounded by mountains in a lake, right on a lake. Beautiful community, had 2,000 Romaniot Jews. How many people know about Romaniot Jews? There again. These were folks, and I had never heard of Romaniot. They traced their origins to 300 BC in Greece. Most Greek Jews are Sephardic, but the Romaniot have been around in Greece since 300 BC. This particular community was not. It actually came in 70 AD. They were being transported as slaves back to Rome by Titus. They were shipwrecked on the coast of the Adriatic, and they came to Yanina. Now, they were deported about 1,800, and only 70 came back. There's now about 50 left in the community. But a JTA piece by a JTA stringer told the whole story of the Romaniot. And I think, to me, one of the things that's really compelling about these stories is it's not just we lose a Jewish community. Bad enough. But we lose a culture of 2,000 years? Are we allowing ourselves to do that? It's really easy, I know, sometimes to take the story like this summer with all the violence in Europe, take that story and run with it. But the underlying anti-Semitism was at a very high level. What happened at Gaza was a spike. And by the way, the spike, you didn't see it really in places like Eastern Europe. But that higher level is there, and it's continuing, and it's multifaceted. And besides your type of take on how important this issue is for the American Jewish community. It's also those types of stories that really need to keep being written to understand really what's at stake and how much the resources the American Jewish community should be putting to this issue. Now, I want to just touch on a couple other issues really quickly and then kind of wind up. This is not, as I said, just about Gaza. This is about a larger term, longer term problem. Whenever the Gazas creep up, we will see a spike, but it's not fundamentally about just Gaza. Far from it. In the Middle East, we have levels of anti-Semitism and the phenomena of anti-Semitism without Jews, and a great irony that in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, anti-Semitism was an export product from Europe back into the Middle East. Now it's being exported from the Middle East back into Europe, often to diaspora Muslim communities, but not only. In Greece, I went to a bookstore in Athens, looked like a Barnes & Noble, and I asked for the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They had two copies, two different editions, and as I learned, there are 29 different versions that circulate in Greece, and almost every bookstore you can find them. And on Athens television recently, there was advertisements for get a free copy of the Protocols if you buy a subscription to a local paper. Turkey, I was told you won't find them in secular bookstores, but in more religious neighborhoods you will. But if you looked at those of you who I'm sure looked at the ADL survey, throughout the Middle East, the numbers of the ADL index, which I think ADL itself will say is not perfect, but is really illustrative in some ways. The anti-Semitism index in the Middle East was from the 70s to the 90s, consistently. And this is not, even without Jews, and except in countries like a few in Iran, few now still left in Morocco and Tunisia, this is a problem not just for those countries. And frankly, you see some of that in the destruction of Christian Yazidi communities in the Middle East right now and other minority religious communities. But is pernicious in the worldwide spread of anti-Semitism. And what do we do about that? And finally, I want to talk about the issue of circumcision. We don't define circumcision and attempts to ban it in Europe as anti-Semitism. If you listen to the people largely who are arguing for this, they talk about children's autonomy and the necessity of letting children to grow up and make those decisions themselves. Now, are there some Islamophobic people and are there some anti-Semites behind this? Certainly. But we are arguing on the basis of religious freedom, that our fellow democracies have all signed the pledges to your religious freedom, and though religious freedom is not absolute, certainly not in this country, but you do not overturn religious freedom without a compelling state interest. They have no compelling state interest. And not throughout all of Europe, but through Scandinavia and the Nordic countries, this is a real problem. And for small Jewish communities in these states, I think circumcision right now still remains the biggest threat. Because if you ban it, and Denmark was debating it just this past week, if you ban it, you have three choices, because circumcision is essentially universal among Jews. You can take an 8-day-old male baby across a state line, you can do it underground illegally, or you can emigrate. And a lot of people are going to emigrate. And when a small community like that starts deteriorating, the core of the community leaves, I think that's the swan song for the rest of the community. So that's another thing that we will be facing in the coming years. I think I've taken entirely too much time. There are a whole series of private, public diplomatic steps that we are taking, most of the time behind the scenes. Sometimes because we feel it's the best. Sometimes we have Jewish communities who ask us not to make things public. A lot of times I feel good about, I'd love to denounce somebody or some government action, and I don't, because the community says it will rebound on us, and private diplomacy is much more important. But of course there are times public diplomacy is important, and not just bilateral. Next Wednesday and Thursday in Berlin, we have the 10th anniversary of the Berlin Anti-Semitism Conference, and your government in the United States has worked very, very, very hard. And not just my office, we're just a small piece of it. but our OSCE staff, our Berlin staff, our State Department European Bureau, to make sure this conference is taken seriously at this time. Hopefully coming out of this will be some rededication on a whole range of issues that will allow us to combat anti-Semitism. Let me just say at the end, we can't do it alone. U.S. State Department certainly can't. Even with our allies, if they are determined themselves to make sure they remain open, pluralistic, tolerant societies that protect their religious minorities, even together we can't do it. We're going to have the help of nonprofits, of NGOs, anti-racist NGOs, Jewish NGOs, and the single biggest, again, stakeholder in that range, in that area, is the American Jewish community. It's only going to be done together. And let's also understand something. We are not going to end anti-Semitism. Not in my lifetime, not in my kids' lifetime, not in my grandchildren's lifetime, not in my great-grandchildren's lifetime. I'll stop at that because I don't know much beyond that. But it's been around 2,300 years. It is ubiquitous. But the metaphor I like to use is it's like a faucet. We're not turning off the faucet. But if we are smart and we work together, we're going to be able to turn the faucets down. And that in itself will be a huge accomplishment and will save, I believe, many of these communities that are under tremendous pressure today. A couple of people asked me if I'm having a great time in this job, and I'm loath to say, yeah, it's great, because of the topic. And it can get depressing at times. I frankly have not found myself very depressed. I actually feel that what we can do, turning down that faucet, is worthwhile. And I like to use the Perkei Avot, you're not required to finish the task, but neither are you absolved from beginning it. And I like that quote, but I actually like another quote from Rabbi Tarfon from Perkei Avot, and I kind of almost every day I think about this, and I hope you do in a lot of your jobs as well. The day is short. There is a great deal of work. The workers are lazy. The reward is great, and the master is insistent. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.